All right, so our session 3 is decision making in aging.
Yes.
And we're very, very pleased to have Brian Knutson coming up from Stanford to talk about decision making in aging, emerging insights from affective neuroscience and neuroeconomics. Brian?
So it's definitely an honor to be here speaking to all the people I cite. And it's sort of random that I'm here and you're sitting there, so I'm hoping there'll be some change up. And in that spirit, I'll try to go as fast as I can so I can hear everybody else. I'm supposed to do a sort of a framing presentation, give a little bit of background to some new thinking, especially in the fields of neuroeconomics and also in affective neuroscience. And a sense of the progress, I'll give you an example of some findings that come from our lab, but boy, there are a lot of findings from lots of labs all around, including people who are here, and so you'll hear about some of those today. It's a great time, actually, I think, in this interdisciplinary area, but, and then I'll talk about some implications, and I'm sure we'll talk about more as the session progresses. I would like to roll back all the way to 5 years ago. For some of us, that's not that long, and to this quote, which was in the top cited journal in neuroscience, Nature Neuroscience, in an editorial. And it said, the editor said, cognitive science is not yet close to explaining or predicting human decision-making in the real world. And if nothing else, I'd like to convince you that something has happened since that time. But you'll have to decide for yourself at the end of all of these presentations. Now, I'm going to do a great injustice to many people by simplifying fields into one sentence. But here's how I think of these fields. So one interesting new field is affective neuroscience. And one way of thinking of that field is, how does the brain evaluate? How does it value things? And that's a huge simplification. It's a very hard problem. But we have new tools that can allow us to get some purchase on this problem. The second field, neuroeconomics, I think of as asking the question, how does the brain decide or choose to do something? Now, if you put these two things together, evaluation and decision, then you should be able to predict choice. That's the bottom line. Okay, so there may be theoretical advances, but in the end, we should be able to predict choice. And if we're talking about aging, we should be able to develop tools that will allow us to predict choice as it changes over the lifespan. But that's a big developmental project, and many of us are engaged in that right now. Just to roll back further than 5 years ago, there's a substantial literature suggesting that as you age, there's some cognitive decline that occurs, particularly in fluid rather than crystallized intelligence, or whatever you want to call it, executive function. And that has been a predominant story in the aging literature. I'm probably going to repeat my colleague and collaborator Laura here, but it bears repeating. One promise of affective neuroscience, at least, is that we can start to look at emotion as it operates in the brain dynamically under choice scenarios, and try to add that into the equation of how people choose. So not just thinking about diminutions in executive function, but think about how emotions are operating and interacting with executive function. And there is some evidence suggesting that while there are changes in emotion that occur over the lifespan, and again, I'm referring to my colleague here, her work and others, those of others in this session, that there's also preservation. So just as if with cognition, while there's preservation of sort of crystallized knowledge, with affect or emotion, there may be an interesting asymmetry and the preservation of sort of positive versus negative emotional capacities. I always like to put this up to remind me to say that you can probably hear me if I don't use this microphone. Is that true? I need to hear it. Oh, you got to hear it? Okay. Okay, so this is going to remind me to say that there is quite a substantial body of animal work suggesting that you can put an electrode in the brain of an animal and allow it to stimulate that electrode, and it will work very hard to do that, to the exclusion of other attractive activities like eating and drinking and sleeping and having sex. And many of these areas that support this kind of behavior are subcortical. Okay. There are also other circuits that support aversive behavior. That means the rat will work very hard to turn off the stimulation. So this allows us some points of departure when we're thinking about if we want to look in the brains of humans as they're feeling and making decisions, where do we need to look? We probably want to look at the cortex and the subcortex. We need a method that will get us down there. We also probably want to look fast in time because we know that these circuits, based on some monkey work that was more recently done in the 1990s, are modulated by the neurochemical dopamine, at least, and other neurochemicals. And this modulation occurs not just in response to rewards, but also in anticipation of rewards and punishments. So we need a method with decent spatial resolution and decent temporal resolution to get at these circuits. And lucky for us, in early 1990s, 1993, a method came along, functional magnetic resonance imaging, that does allow us the spatial and temporal resolution at least to see subcortically and also to see millimeter by millimeter what's changing. It also gives us a second-to-second resolution, not as good as EEG, but it's getting you deep, remember. And this is the time scale upon which many of us make decisions and consider what's going on in the world. So this, in theory, this temporal resolution should get us into the realm not only of making a choice or responding to an outcome, but also anticipating what you're going to do. This is just a summary of some ideas that we've derived from some work that we've done and others have done. But the basic idea flows from some ideas of Bashara, Damasio, George Loewenstein in the back of the room, that the emotions that you feel prior to or during the course of decision making actually influence what you do. So this is in distinction to the reactions you have to something that already happened, okay? And if that's true, then we need to be able to look at what's happening in the brain at those time points to actually capture what's happening. And I'm going to show you some data that suggests we can do that to some extent. And if that's true, it may be the case that cues for rewards or punishments or gains or losses may activate these areas. That this activation may be correlated to some extent with self-reported if we ask people at the right time point or with the right degree of specificity what's going on. We stop them in the middle of the task, for instance, and we say, when you saw that cue, how did you feel? And that should actually have the capacity to influence behavior, especially if we have markers for valence or value. So that means if we have an index of neural activity that anticipates gain versus loss, we should be able to make a directional prediction about whether that animal will approach or avoid the outcome that it's considering. And this should actually apply to all kinds of different risky scenarios. This is just a task that we developed based on monkey research and rat research going all the way back to Pavlov. It's a very simple task in which all we're trying to do is elicit anticipation of gains and losses. We're not trying to alter choice. We're not trying to alter behavioral responses. We're simply trying to manipulate what people expect will happen. And it's a little bit hard to see in the back of the room. But the way that we do that is we show people cues for 2 seconds. The cues can indicate that people can either gain money or avoid losing money. They wait a few seconds, and then they see a rapidly presented target. This is anywhere from 150 to 300 milliseconds. All that they have to do is press the button when they see the target before it disappears. Depending on whether they were successful and what the cue indicated, they can either make money or avoid losing money. If they're unsuccessful, if they respond too slowly, then they either don't gain money or they lose money. So again, we're interested in the brain response to the outcomes, but when we're thinking about anticipatory affective activation, we're actually very interested in what's happening during this anticipatory interval before you've responded and before you've received any outcome. Okay? And fMRI should give us the capacity to visualize that. And because so much time has passed since 2004, over 20 studies have been done with this paradigm, and this is a meta-analysis of those studies. And the collected results of those studies indicate, and there are actually more, but this was published last year, they indicate that when you're anticipating gain versus losses of the same magnitude, you tend to see more activation in these subcortical regions, right about in the same area where Olds and Milner stuck their electrode to get the rat to self-stimulate, including the nucleus accumbens and the ventral striatum. You also see some interesting things happening in other deep cortical regions that seem to lean either equally towards gains and losses or more towards losses. This is not as strong a dissociation between gains and losses, but we do have candidate structures where we can use activation as an index to try to predict that people will avoid something as opposed to approach it. So why am I here? Why am I talking to you today? Well, because of a great grad student that is unfortunately leaving my lab now, Greg Salmon as Larkin, we got some money, and because of NIA too, let it be said, to look at people of different ages and to do this simple task with them, to just look at what happens when they're anticipating gains and losses, monetary gains and losses. And remember, we can control performance in this paradigm. So we can manipulate the duration of the target so people have an equivalent performance rate across all the different cues. So we can basically latch on performance and look at the anticipatory activation. We can also ask people, how did you feel? How did you feel when you saw that cue that indicated you could make $5? How did you feel when you saw that cue that indicated that you could lose $5? And not surprisingly, When people say that, see the cue that indicates they can make $5, they tend to feel more of what we call positive arousal. That's simply feeling positive and aroused. So these are feelings like excitement and energy. And it scales with the amount that you can make. And this happens for both young and old people, actually. Old people show equivalent excitement as young people and self-report when they see these cues. We see something different when we look at cues that indicate that you may lose money. For young people, we see this is actually not positive arousal, this is negative arousal. So these are feelings that are aroused but negative. These would be akin to anxiety, irritation, fear, and so forth. And what we see there is in young people, the more they think they can lose, the more negative arousal they feel. But we see a marked blunting of this response in older people. So there's this asymmetrical affective response during anticipation of gains and losses. Now this is just self-report, right? What about in the brain? What is happening there? Well, if we contrast activity in this anterior insular region that we think is implicated in anticipation of losses, what we see is that when people are anticipating making money, this has also been implicated in arousal and all kinds of different things. We see an increase at the high level of activation in this region. And we also see the same asymmetrical pattern for younger people when they think they can lose money, but we don't see a symmetrical pattern in this region for older people when they think they can lose money. So again, we see a flatter profile. We also see the same kind of profile of neural response in another area near the thalamus. So these regions are showing a response profile that seems more in line with feeling arousal than feeling value. And this is basically a group map, contrasting the loss anticipation response of older adults versus younger adults. And these are samples of 20 older adults aged 60 to 80 and 20 younger adults aged 20 to 40. What does this mean? This was surprising to us, actually. It was surprising to me. Because one hypothesis is that older adults just feel less arousal overall. And we should have been able to pick that up here. But actually, if we read Laura's theory of socio-emotional selectivity, it suggests that older adults are going to, on average, be more responsive to positive stimuli than to negative stimuli. This may be happening not only in response to outcomes, but also during anticipation of these stimuli. This is very interesting. And it suggests, if we think that affect, I'm not saying you do, but we think that anticipatory affect drives learning, drives choice, and so forth, then we should see biases in older adults and how well they learn about losses, and also how they take risks and approach and avoid various potential losses. Because I'm probably short on time, I'm going to just describe the first set of instances where older adults are actually learning. And these, by the way, these tasks are all incentive compatible, so people are paid in cash, everybody's paid in cash at the end of the experiment, and they all know that. They're learning either to approach a cue that indicates a gain, and they learn this, or they learn to avoid a cue that indicates a similar loss. The other cue indicates probabilistically that they won't make anything, or they won't lose anything. And you can actually, I won't go into details because I'm running out of time, and I won't go into that slide, but I will move to this slide. This is a very large community sample of a lifespan sample taken from the Bay Area, playing this test, these gain and loss learning tasks. And what you see here is age on the x-axis, and what you see here on the y-axis is the percent correct choices they made. That is, if they were a clairvoyant chooser and they knew which was the right cue, this is the percentage of those choices that they got right. And what you see basically is no consistent pattern of results here when they're learning about gains. But when you look at loss learning, again, this is exactly the same incentives. These are the same types of fractal cues. Okay, the only thing different about these cues is their value, gain or loss. You see this decline with age. The older people get, the less good they are at this task of loss learning, which is a good or bad cue. Now you may say that, who cares? That's a lab task. Why should we care about that? Well, it turns out we also have information on these people that is related to life financial outcomes, like debt and assets. And we can actually look at the relation of those outcomes to performance on this task. And there is a highly significant association between people's performance on this task and their level of debt, an inverse correlation. And we're now verifying this with FICO scores, which are credit scores. But it looks like there's a pretty tight correlation between our measure and the FICO scores. So this is actually fairly stunning to me because this, by the way, this doesn't predict debt at all. It's just this thing. So this is sort of our exciting new finding this is behavioral, by the way, this isn't brains. We have brain activation on these people too, which we're analyzing, but I'm just excited about the behavior. So I'm running out of time. what do I want to leave you with? I want to leave you with the idea that with these new tools and concepts, we can start to deconstruct choice. We can think about different things that go into choice, gain anticipation, loss aversion. How do you integrate those things in the brain? We can also extend, once we develop these metrics and assays, we can extend them to older subjects across the lifespan. What we're seeing right now is there seems to be some reduction in loss anticipation in older subjects. They seem to learn about losses more slowly. They may have integrative issues too. I didn't show you some stock picking data that we also have on this sample, but we have some additional data on integrating across losses and gains, which can be corrected by providing them the correct integrative information. What are the implications? Writ large, I think you're going to see examples of this in the next few presentations. Once we deconstruct choice, we can try to reconstruct it. We can specify what an optimal choice path is, and then we can try to account for behavior that both matches that path and goes beyond that path. We can try to reintegrate emotion and cognition into decision-making. We can strive for prediction, not just correlation. We can use these tools in a temporally sensitive way to try to predict choice in the lab and in the real world. And here's a crazy idea. What if we see biases in older people or in anybody? Well, if we understand these mechanisms, then can we engineer decision prostheses for these people? Obviously, we want to be sensitive to their goals, what they want. But once we know that, and if we know they're deviating, could we think about how to engineer these prostheses? Well, we haven't convinced everyone that there's been progress. This was published last week. 5 reasons neuroeconomics is a big fat hoax. I won't make the obvious ad hominem rejoinder, but I will say that this source is Fox News. And so with enemies like that, who needs friends, right? So this is the most important slide. These are the people that dragged me into this. And I'm glad they did. Rick Samuels Larkin, Laura Carstensen. This is a part of the NASDAQ, actually, that funds investor education research, and of course, NIA, also for inviting me here today. Thanks.
So we have some time for questions for Brian. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Thanks a lot.
Really helpful.
I was wondering how specific you think your findings are to material loss versus, let's say, relational loss or whatever.
Good question.
Everybody hear it? Material versus relational.
So, hi, Jocelyn. Jocelyn asked, how specific are these findings to sort of material loss, monetary loss, for instance, secondary incentives, versus, say, relational, social, or even, say, primary rewards, right? We don't know. What we do know is, and what I didn't emphasize, but maybe others will, is that there is overlap in these circuits in terms of when you look at, like Sam has done nice work, and George, looking at juice rewards, and what you see when people are learning about juice rewards, they learn to anticipate juice rewards, you see activation in some of the same circuits. So that suggests there's overlap with primary and secondary rewards. You can also ask about social rewards, and others have done research showing that when you learn to cooperate with somebody, you anticipate you're going to give them money and they're going to give you money back. You also see recruitment of these circuits. So that, together, that information suggests, even though we don't know how one scales against the other, and what are the individual differences, that there may be some transferability, that people may be using the same machinery to evaluate different kinds of commodities. So.
Heather? I actually think you were first.
I have maybe a very simple question, which is I was struck by the number of people who had no or minimal gain learning.
I was too.
Are there any implications of like having no gain learning whatsoever?
I really don't know. You know, what we think is happening behaviorally is people are choosing a cue and sticking with it. They just stick with that cue. By the way, the cues are randomly balanced, counterbalanced from side to side, right? So maybe they figure, I don't really care that much if I gain or something like that. Or remember, these are probabilistic cues, so they will be rewarded sometimes, 30% of the time on the low probability cue. So what they're trying to do is find the high probability gain. There may be some people that are satisfied with the low probability gain. But one interesting behavioral pattern we see is when you're losing, you're not satisfied with the high probability loss. You actually are more likely to shift. But I don't know why some people refuse to switch.
And then some people, I guess the people who had 100% were lucky?
Yeah, they picked the right cue and they stuck with it, basically.
Heather?
I was wondering if you could comment on how these findings square with the positivity effect. So I would have predicted perhaps that you'd see more of the action on the positive side, and yet you see the association with loss learning as well as the negative arousal.
Yeah.
So what the hell?
Yeah, I know. I don't, I'm not an expert. You're sitting next to the expert. But I'm not an expert in this theory. We were surprised to see this. I'm not sure, but once you start to look at the data, and once I've started to look at the data, this is probably confirmation bias, right? But I started to notice that in a lot of experiments, there was sort of this lack of response to negative things instead of a hyper response to positive things in older people. Is this a fair assessment? Okay. And I think Nara has some data like this.
Well, just in terms of the positivity
Yeah,
effect,
right.
it's really an age by valence interaction.
Yeah.
So, almost all the memory data, it's all just,
It's relative.
and you can't ever counterbalance positive and negative stimuli. So you can't just say, looking at older adults, that there's a positivity effect, because your positive stimuli might be more memorable for other reasons. So that's the problem so the action really is on sort of the
balance.
interaction between
But I think,
negative and positive.
but I like that question, because I like thinking more specifically about it. What exactly is it? Is it the positivity? Is it the negativity? The only way you can do that is split out things according to frame and have neutral options, right? And the reason this finding blows me away as an investigator is because if you were an expected utility theorist, or if you just were simply a behaviorist, you wouldn't make any distinction between losses and gains. It would all be the same mechanism, right? But actually, the fact that there may be different learning mechanisms is deeply important for decision making, and may really inform how we intervene if we need to intervene. And I'm speaking broadly there. I'm talking about behavioral and pharmacological and other interventions.
We're done. Oh, sorry. We're done.
Thanks.
So the next talk is by Natalie Denburg from the University of Iowa, who's going to talk about the neurobasis of decision-making and aging.
Thank you for having me. I really do have 3 slides, other than my title slide and my acknowledgement slide. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training, clinical neuropsychologist also, and I study the cognitive neuroscience of aging, and I'm trying to move into more social neuroscience of aging. And for the work I'm going to present, there's kind of an overarching hypothesis, and that's the idea that there are some seemingly normal older adults, that is without overt neurological or psychiatric disease, who have or who manifest reasoning and decision-making deficits that we believe is due to dysfunction in a neural system that includes the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. For the last 5 years, about 4.5 years, I've had a K01 from NIA, so I'm going to be talking about that program of research. And before I tell you about the neuroimaging results today, I do need to give you a little bit of background about the behavioral findings. Okay. So, I use a task called the Iowa gambling task, and I'm assuming most people are familiar with it, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But I use a task called the Iowa gambling task, which has been shown to be a sensitive and specific laboratory measure for damage to this region, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And patients who have sustained damage to this region from a stroke or a tumor resection end up having social deficits in their everyday life. It's kind of like a modern-day Phineas Gage. Gage still had his intellect, he had his memory ability, but he was quote-unquote no longer Gage, he was inappropriate, he didn't come to work, and so on and so forth. And we study these individuals, and the only deficit we can find in the laboratory is a deficit on this Iowa gambling task. So I brought younger and older adults into the laboratory, and we have a finding that's held a couple of replications over. On my y-axis, I have the number of cards chosen. There's a max of 100 cards. And across the x-axis, I have the 3 groups. Younger adults, this is how I think everybody in this room would do. 93% of younger adults play this task advantageously. And by advantageously, I mean above chance, using a binomial theorem. There's another group and then there's the older adults. And the older adults can be divided into 3 groups. There's about a third of the older adults who perform disadvantageously, and we're going to call them impaired. And they choose more from the bad decks, this light bar, than the dark bar, the good decks. And we see it as the opposite as the younger adults. Then there's a third group, older unimpaired, of older adults who perform this task above chance. So we have similarity, younger and older unimpaired, and then we have this third group, about a third, and then about 93% of younger adults. So this is how we classify impaired and unimpaired, and I'm going to use those terms later on. We've also found with these same individuals, unimpaired and impaired, that they have defective autonomic responses. And you just heard a tiny bit about this, and I could talk for hours on this idea. But in anticipation, just before you make a decision, say at night you're walking home late at night and you think about walking down an alley to kind of take a shortcut home, but your stomach turns over and you say, maybe I shouldn't go that way. The idea is that we have bodily responses that shape our decisions, hopefully in advantageous ways. And patients with damage to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex don't have those types of advantageous bodily responses. And this is essentially Dr. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis. It's also referred to as the as-if body loop. But what's interesting here is that in our unimpaired older adults, they discriminate between the good and bad decks. Anticipatorily, if that's a word, I'm not sure, prior to choosing from cards, they have differential skin conductance response or bodily response prior to the choice. By contrast, the older impaired are kind of flat. They don't discriminate. Also bringing up Carstenson's theory, what's interesting here is that the dark bar to the good decks is higher than the light bar. This isn't supposed to happen. In younger adults, or we'll say we gave the task to everybody in this room, you would show the greatest anticipation to the bad decks and then a relatively lower anticipation to the good decks. We have the opposite here. Older adults are kind of more reactive, if you will, to the good decks than the bad decks. Maybe a positivity effect going on here. But the most important point here is that this is kind of flat and no discrimination, perhaps leading them to perform poorly behaviorally, and then we see the discrimination here. Now, this is all in the laboratory. You know, somebody could say, kind of, who cares? And in a way, I do say that, and it's part of the reason why we did this third study. And in this study, we call this consumer decision making. And we've taken advertisements that the Federal Trade Commission have deemed deceptive, and we've brought those into the laboratory, and we've created non-deceptive counterparts. And these are presented to the older adults and younger adults, and they read through the booklet kind of in an incidental fashion. They're told, we're going to show you the following advertisements. They were shown in Sports Illustrated and magazines like Women's Day in the last year. Go ahead, read through them. When you're finished, let us know, and we want to ask you about your impressions of the advertisements. But what we actually test is their comprehension of the advertisement claim, and then we also test their purchase intentions. So we've got our same groups here. We've got younger adults who performed advantageously on the Iowa gambling task, 93% of the whole younger adult sample. About a third of the older adults who are unimpaired, comparable to the younger adults, and then another third of impaired older adults who performed disadvantageously on the Iowa gambling task. This first figure is comprehension of claims on the y-axis, and the second figure, purchase intentions. So what I want you to notice is that in the full disclosure, this is the non-deceptive ad for both graphs, everybody's performing pretty comparably. There's no group differences there. As soon as the deceptive ad is given, however, we see comprehension of claims drop significantly for the impaired older adults, and we see purchase intentions increase significantly for the impaired older adults. So this is what we've been doing behaviorally and psychophysiologically, and we've been following these groups of older adults, impaired, unimpaired, and now we've brought them into the neuroimaging laboratory to look at whether there's a neuroanatomical basis for this. So there's several different possibilities. One is obviously the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. We talk about this all the time at Iowa. It's kind of the buzzword. It's possible that we would see some sort of physiological dysfunction in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Another good possibility is that these people are kind of in a subdrome or a subsyndromal or prodrome phase of Alzheimer's disease. They don't have Alzheimer's now, and these are people who are all healthy. After 6 hours of neuropsychological testing, we know that they're cognitively intact. But in 5 years, they could look much worse. Another possibility is the frontal aging hypothesis by Robert West, and that was really a theory about dorsolateral aging. Perhaps this is a dorsolateral finding. So we brought them into the lab, to the neuroimaging lab, and we've just completed these data. So these are kind of hot off the press. And on top, I'm showing you PET findings, impaired decision makers minus unimpaired, for 37 older adults, and down below I want to just briefly mention the structural neuroimaging findings because it tends to concur with the FTG PET findings. So in this first group, there are 20 unimpaired older adults, 17 impaired, age range 60 to 90 years. The groups are identical in terms of age, 76 years. Education, 16 years on average. Full-scale IQ differed a little bit, 114 and 123. 114 for the impaired, 123 for the unimpaired, so I controlled for full-scale IQ. Working memory index, 114, high average. Beck depression inventory, 3 to 5. Mini mental status exam, 29 for both groups. And AVLT recall, memory recall after 30 minutes, a standard deviation above, 9 to 10. So these are really intact older adults. So what do we find? I really thought we might find a dorsolateral finding here, even though I've been putting my money on VMPC for a long time. So what we find, and this is kind of an overlay, the blue suggests lower metabolism among the impaired relative to the unimpaired older adults. And this is a group analysis where we have overlaid this on a PET image. This is not a structural MRI, so I would mention that because this is preliminary, the specificity of the areas could change a little bit. The structural MRI will give us, to overlay the PET images on a structural MRI will give us specificity I don't have at this point, but I think that some conclusions can be made. So if we kind of draw a line right here, we have a little bit of activity here, ventral medial prefrontal cortex. We have a lot of findings in medial prefrontal cortex. This is kind of the big winner, if you will. And then you can't see it from this perspective, but we have significant findings in right insula, and insula's come up several times today in terms of representing bodily states or emotional states. And then in addition, there's some findings in the caudate. And this may seem surprising, but we actually have a prediction study going on with the Iowa electronics market where we predicted the presidential campaign last year, and we find that lower caudate volume does indeed correlate with poorer prediction ability. And then I'll just say that in the structural neuroimaging finding where we looked at cortical thickness with free surfer, we see findings in the anterior cingulate. So in summary, it appears that impaired older adult decision makers show involvement of neural circuitry that's already been talked about as being important for advantageous decision making, specifically ventromedial prefrontal cortex, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and the insula on the right. No evidence for parietal or medial temporal alterations, and this is good because biparietal temporal hypometabolism on a PET scan is indicative of Alzheimer's disease. And then finally, these are some future directions. We have genetic data on all these 37 individuals, and that's being analyzed currently. And then we're going to be conducting a PET study, an fMRI study this summer with these individuals to investigate this again and to look at some other issues like the default network. Thank you very much.
In the back, is that?
Oh, yes. I find the structural difference to be very, very interesting, especially in ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Is your suggestion that something happens in aging, that therefore there becomes a structural difference? Or rather, since you have the differences in other areas, say dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, it's something that there's always been a structural difference. You've been able to overcome it as a younger adult, and then with aging, that effect that's always been there materializes.
So I don't have the data to answer that question accurately, but I would say that I think that this is an age-related phenomenon and not some sort of morphometric developmental issue. I believe that these people have kind of accrued this over time. So there's been some sort of physiological dysfunction in the context of normal aging or quote-unquote normal aging.
So the blue areas that you're seeing there are connected, the caudate and the MPFC. And so do you, are you doing DTI to see if you could look at connectivity there?
So we did do DTI in this sample, although it was only done on about 18 individuals. Still analyzing those data, but I don't know that anything's jumping out at me, to be honest with you, in terms of the FA values.
I mean, what I find interesting about your good decision makers is they show this response to reward, essentially.
Right.
And so we can hypothesize that people who have problems in the blue areas aren't anticipating reward very well. And that actually fits in with quite a nice literature. So, but it's interesting that I guess the healthy controls that are younger don't show that same pattern. Or did I get that wrong from your?
No,
Okay,
you're
okay.
correct. The younger adults look the opposite of the unimpaired older adults, skin conductance-wise. So they look like Dr. Bashar and Dr. Damasio have always talked about anticipation of the negative.
Great, thanks.
So our next talk is from Mara Mather from USC on age and sex differences and the effects of stress on decision making.
Great, thank you. So this is a talk that really fits the bill for new data that still has a lot of questions about it. I got interested in this question of what stress is doing to decision making by looking at these different literatures across two disciplines. So in the stress literature, there are now some studies looking at stress effects in humans during tasks in the fMRI scanner. So you can start to see what brain regions in acute stress are showing differences than they would be in non-stressful situations. And it matches up with animal literatures showing many of the same regions that we just heard about from Natalie's talk. So ventromedial prefrontal cortex, cingulate, medial prefrontal, the insula. And it's really striking when you start looking at this literature how much it overlaps with decision-making circuitry. So there's that sort of analog there. And then we know from the decision-making literature from work by George Loewenstein, by Antonio Damasio and others, that emotion plays an integral role in decision-making. And in particular, the somatic marker theory would posit that your bodily state is influencing the way that you're making decisions. So all of these things really point to the idea that stress should be influencing the way that we make decisions. And then, of course, if you think about everyday life, in the real world, when you make decisions, they're quite often the important decisions have to be made in stressful situations. The decisions themselves might elicit stress, and sometimes you are just in a stressful situation needing to make an important decision about an investment, about your health, about buying a house. All of these really important decisions in life typically come with stress, either from time pressure or because the decision is so important or you're in stressful circumstances. So these seem like really an important question with all sorts of reasons pointing to the fact that stress is going to have an influence on decision making. Yet there's really very little information out there, very little research on the effects of stress on how people make decisions. Now, we were interested in both age differences and sex differences. The age differences, from Natalie's talk, you can get a sense of why we were interested in age differences. If there are differences in how these brain regions associated with both stress and decision-making are faring under aging, there might be differences in how stress is going to influence decision-making. Now, I must admit the sex differences were something that sort of emerged in our data, and then once we started seeing this, we realized there's a huge literature. Shelley Taylor and others have pointed out all these behavioral differences in how stress affects behavior. And so today what I will tell you about are 3 initial studies that we've done. The first one shows age differences in the effects of stress on decision-making using a driving game. And then in the next 2 studies, we have younger adults, and we're looking at sex differences on the balloon analog wrist task in the first study. And then the third study is an fMRI analog of the balloon analog wrist task. So what sort of stress are we using? There's lots of different ways you can think about stress. In our studies, we decided to use the cold pressor task. And this is a physical stressor where people are asked to hold their hand in ice water for 3 minutes in the stress condition, and in the control condition, they hold their hand in warm water for 3 minutes. And we reliably get cortisol elevations about 20 minutes after the stress inductions in the people who were in the stress condition and not in the other condition. And so we timed our games for their decision-making tasks for that period when there would be elevated cortisol. And in the first study, they played a driving game. In this game, they just get points for the further they drive the car while the light is yellow. But at any random point between 2 and 7 seconds, they're not told the timing, but that it is fully random in the game, the light turns red. And if they're holding that key down, they're driving at that point that the light turns red, a siren plays, and they get pulled over, and they lose their points from that particular trial. If they had stopped the car at that moment and the light turns red, they hear yippee, and they get to keep their points. And so they can stop and start as often as they like, but it depends on what state it's in at the moment it turns red. And what we found was that overall in the younger adult data, we didn't see an effect of stress on how much time they spent driving during that yellow light. But in the older adult group, those who were in the control condition drove almost as much as the younger adults, but in the stress condition, it was a dramatic reduction in how much time they spent, how much of the available time they spent driving. And the other measure we have from our task is how frequently they stopped and started. And we found that for the older adults, they stopped and started less frequently than younger adults in the control condition. But in the stress condition, they stopped and started much more frequently. And that, it's not clear exactly what it is, but it seems like they might be sort of indecisive. You don't have a very organized decision strategy if you're stopping and starting a whole lot. And of course, in a real life driving situation, that's your nightmare driver, who you get to the stoplight and they stop and then they decide to go. And I know I've been that way a couple times myself. So I showed you the younger adult data collapsed across sex, but we had equal numbers of male and female in each condition. And among the younger adults, we found this effect in the stopping and starting data, not in the other data, but where there's an opposite effect for males and females. So males stop and start less frequently if they had been stressed 20 minutes earlier, whereas females stop and start more frequently. And we, in this next study, followed this up looking at the balloon analog risk task. So this is a task widely used, and it measures risk-seeking tendencies. The balloon on the computer screen gets inflated one button press at a time. So it's a very discrete task. And every time it inflates, you get more points. But anytime it inflates, there's a risk it might pop. And you can cash out of your balloon at any time, or you can keep going, So again, it's a measure of how much risk you're willing to take, and you can see the males increased a little bit, the females decreased in terms of how big they blew up their balloons. So this was really quite intriguing to us, that men seem to be getting more risky under stress, whereas females get more conservative. And we wanted to see what the associated brain mechanisms might be of this. So we adapted our study for the fMRI scanner. And in doing so, we had to change the task a little bit. So it was in blocks. And in order to have everyone have the same amount of time that they were playing the game, they could get through different number of balloons. So this introduced another strategy, which was to just crank through a whole lot of balloons and not really blow any of them up very large. And that seems to be where we got this sex difference by stress in this study, where in the control condition, again, the males and the females look pretty similar, but in the stress condition, the males crank through a lot more balloons. In the stress condition, the females don't blow up as many balloons. And in this study, in this fMRI study, we paid people real money for what they'd earned, and indeed the males earned more money in this game under stress than they did in control. Females earned less money than they did in the control group. So what was going on in terms of brain activation while they were in the task? We did a whole brain analysis, and one main area really showed an interaction by sex and stress. And this was the putamen, which is part of the striatum, which Brian was talking about other sort of striatal regions earlier. And just in terms of if we look at the average signal in this region, of course we found that there was an interaction in there, and this is just picturing this interaction by showing you the average signal. And what you're seeing is that for the males, in the stress condition, they're showing more activation than in the control condition, whereas for the females, they're showing less activation. So we were interested in whether this is part of the whole decision network and whether it's interacting differently with other regions for males and females. So we conducted an independent component analysis of brain activity during the task. And this is an analysis that's model-free. The analysis, you don't put in the timeline. It just tells you what regions are activated at the same time, what regions seem to be activating together. And then we get these components for each of the 4 groups. And we were able to say, okay, which component for each group correlates most highly with the period when they're playing that balloon game. So what seems to be the decision network for this task? And for each group, you can see that it was very similar. And I'm just showing you one slice of the brain, but this is the case across all the networks, all the regions that were activated in this network for each group. And I've put a little chart here showing you that this network that was associated with the period of time that they're playing the game was involved the insula, the cingulate, medial prefrontal lateral regions, inferior parietal, and then also involves some regions that have been known to be part of the default network, sort of resting state things, deactivated. But in terms of the putamen, we see this interaction that we saw when we did the whole brain analyses, where both the control females are showing the putamen as part of their network and the stress males, whereas the stress females are not showing it and the control males are not showing it. So the putamen seems to be part of the decision network differentially both by sex and by stress. And then I'm just showing you here a few other regions that were involved in the stress male network that were not involved in other regions, thalamus, precuneus, and caudate. And caudate might be an overall main effect of stress, so that might be interesting for future research. So in conclusion, we have findings that show that stress affects decision making, but it does so quite differently depending both upon age and sex. And in specific, in the first study, stress reduced older adults' risk-taking and increased their stops and starts in a driving game. And in 3 studies, we found that stress increased sex differences in decision-making strategies among younger adults. And one caveat that I would like to say is that I think we could come up with tasks where females would do better under stress, but we haven't yet done that. But I think that they're changing in their strategies, and it's probably the case that it will depend upon the task which sex is going to end up earning more money or whatever the case might be. So, but that's still an open question. And then we also found that stress was associated with increased activation of the putamen for males, but decreased for females. So thank you.
In order to stay on schedule, I think we're going to move ahead to the next talk. And JoNell Strough, is that how you say it? Strough, from West Virginia University, is going to talk to us about the sunk cost fallacy, no time to waste, understanding why older adults are less subject to the sunk cost fallacy.
I just want to thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here to share this research with you today. The sunk cost fallacy is an irrational decision-making bias that occurs when a person makes a decision to invest more as a function of having made a prior investment compared to a similar situation when an investment has not been made. And that's a fallacy because the rational or normatively correct decision is to invest the same amount. And you should invest the same amount in those 2 situations because the cost that you've invested is sunk and you can't recover it. So to look at this effect, what we've done is given people hypothetical situations. So you're staying in a hotel room on vacation. You paid $10.95 to see a movie on pay TV. After 5 minutes, you're bored and the movie seems pretty bad. How much longer would you watch? And we give people a set of alternatives ranging from stop immediately to watch until the very end. And then we give them an analog that has the same information except that they didn't pay for it. and again, ask them how much longer would they watch, and then compare the responses in those two, and if they invest longer in the situation where the 1095 was hypothetically paid, then they committed the sunk cost. And what our initial research showed is that older adults, perhaps surprisingly, were less likely to commit the fallacy. And they were actually also more likely to make the normatively correct response in those situations, in that situation. So I say it may be surprising, but it wasn't actually surprising to us. What we had predicted in terms of the theoretical background for that paper is that judgment and decision-making researchers in understanding this sunk cost fallacy, they point to loss aversion as the underlying mechanism. Specifically, the idea is that people are motivated to avoid loss, and so in sort of this misguided attempt to recover the lost investment, they keep investing more. And so what we were thinking then is, well, how would that concern about loss aversion vary by age? And so for older adults, we were very familiar with Carstensen and colleagues' work on socio-emotional selectivity theory and the positivity bias, and also some research by Wood and colleagues with Iowa gambling task that showed that older adults had a more balanced view of gains and losses. And we contrasted that with a well-documented finding on younger adults that they have this negativity bias in information processing. So given that literature, we had this hypothesis then that older adults might actually do better on this task, and that's what was found in that study. So in terms of socio-emotional selectivity theory, as Laura mentioned in her talk this morning, where that sort of positivity bias is thought to come from is the future time perspective. So in later life, that the future time perspective becomes more limited, and that leads to prioritizing emotionally meaningful goals so that there's age-related maintenance or improvement in emotion regulation. And so what we wanted to do then was to look at that as more directly, that relation between future time perspective and the sunk cost fallacy. And so that's the data that I'm mainly going to focus on today. And so what we hypothesized, based on our prior research, was that older adults would again be less likely to commit the fallacy. They'd have the less expansive future time perspective, and that this less expansive future time perspective would be associated with a lesser tendency to commit the sunk cost fallacy. And I'm pleased to say we were able to replicate that initial result that was published. And we again found in this second study that older adults were less likely to commit the fallacy. Older adults also had a more limited future time perspective, which is what we would expect. And then when we looked at the correlation between the two, what you see on the left is the correlation for everybody. And then on the right-hand side is the line separately for younger and older adults, with the younger adults in blue and the older adults in green. And those findings are consistent with what we hypothesized, namely that the more expansive future time perspective was associated with the greater tendency to commit the sunk cost fallacy. So in terms of why we think the sunk cost fallacy is associated with future time perspective, we really think it's due to something with this positivity effect. And so one thing we're trying to do now, though, since these are correlational data, is to experimentally manipulate future time perspective. And that data is sitting on that computer right now. It just needs to be analyzed. I did take a peek at it. It looks like it does work. We are also looking at other irrational decision-making biases that have negative affect as sort of the hypothesized mechanism. So one of them being counterfactual reasoning, also referred to as the if-only bias, which is thought to involve regret. And we find the same effect with that bias, as we do with the sunk cost fallacy, that older adults are actually less likely to commit that if only bias. And then the other thing that we're looking at, again, drawing from socio-emotional selectivity theory, is that, remember from the talks this morning, that what's thought to be going on with socio-emotional selectivity theory is that it's guiding these goals. And so in this study, we actually asked people, what were your goals, what did you want to have happen when you were making these decisions about these sunk costs? And so we have some qualitative data on that we've been coding, and I'll just show you quickly some of that. So what you see here, actually, if you compare the 2 bars on the left to the 2 bars on the right, that's the decision analog, whether that was the investment analog or the no investment analog. And these goals that we're coding in this instance are the investment concerns. And so there's a main effect for analog, which is a good thing, right? From a measurement perspective, you want them to be, the investment to be more salient when it's the investment analog. But when you look at the left side there, that age difference is significant as well. So the younger adults are more likely to be saying things like, I want to get my money's worth, or if I paid for the movie, I'm going to see it through. So they do seem to be attending a little bit more to the amount of the information, or amount of the investment, at least when you ask them about their goals. We have similar results if you look at it the other way. No investment, it works the same way, just kind of the mirror opposite. In terms of what older adults are doing more of, I don't have a slide on this, but they seem to be mentioning things like personal characteristics, so that's just the way I am. So not really pointing necessarily to any aspect of this. So those findings are still a little puzzling to us. So let's see. I just want to quickly acknowledge the support for the research and also to travel to attend this workshop, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
In your scenario, they lose money to save time. Now, what if they spent a bunch of time?
Oh, and in the other, it's a good question. Well, okay. I'll let you finish your question. I think I know what you're asking.
It seems like your theory would predict the opposite pattern if they invested time in exchange for money, because then the old people who have little time, they don't want to lose that time that they've invested. So the young people should display a greater sunk cost effect when you flip the attributes around, according to your theory.
Well, I do know that we have another vignette that I didn't show in the example that deals with time. So it's an investment of time. You've spent either 1 month or 5 months on this hobby, and you see the same effect in terms of the age difference. Now I'd have to go back and look at the data.
Like it goes against the time is scarce.
Well, we see the same sunk cost effect in terms of age. I'd have to look at the correlation separately for those vignettes to, I think, really answer what you're asking. Yeah, and that correlational data was the sunk cost fallacy. There is collapsed across 4 vignettes, 2 of which dealt with time and 2 of which dealt with money. So,
But isn't it future time that's scarce? It's
Yes,
not
that's
spent time that's
yeah.
scarce. So
That's how much
That's
time.
And there is an investment of time in the movie. You've invested some time watching it, if you want to think of it that way too. But yeah, it's something we're definitely interested in terms of what's the domain specificity. Is it time? Do people think differently about time versus about money?
With counterfactuals, was it a particular type of situation you were asking about counterfactuals in, or was it generally whether people were using that kind of reasoning in their everyday life?
It was, again, these sort of classic tasks that have been used in the decision-making research. I was able to, a colleague of mine, Paul Kloczynski, has done some of this research with adolescents, and so I just adapted some of his tasks. But they were situations where a person had thought about not doing the course of action, and then they did it anyway, versus a situation where they had not had that kind of thought and just done it. So the example is somebody was at the grocery store, they thought about parking further away to get some exercise, they changed their mind, they took a close spot, they got in a car accident, versus they just took the closest spot. Okay, so the idea is that if you thought about doing it differently, then that makes it easier to mentally reverse. And that reversal is what's the regret, like, oh, I should have done what I was meant to do the first time.
I was just wondering if there was any evidence about whether there are any age differences in the use of counterfactual thinking in everyday life.
Say that again?
If there's any evidence that in everyday life older people don't use counterfactual thinking.
I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting,
It's one of the things that's very
interesting
good
kind
for
of
your mental health,
strategy.
obviously.
Yeah, in terms of, yeah.
So you found that older adults use less counterfactual thinking?
Yes.
And did you find that across the different scenarios and domains that you used?
Yeah,
and were they like the Epstein domains that are the Epstein?
Yeah, they were. There's the car one. Let's see, that's the one that sort of stands out the most.
Because I was just wondering, I used those tasks too, and actually I find a lot of variability in whether they engage in counterfactual, and their personal relevance came in. So for one of them, it's like, my wife wanted me to park here.
Yeah, we have
whatever,
that one.
and
We have that one as
I
well.
decided to park here and got in an accident,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
And older adults would respond, you better believe I'll do what my wife said,
Yeah.
because I don't want to take the flak for that, and blah, blah, blah. So they had a whole different, the criteria they used for making the decision was totally different than the quote-unquote abstract criteria of
Right.
counterfactual thinking. And so did you get any kind
Well,
of data?
that's something we're very interested in, and we could certainly go back and analyze the data that way to pull those dimensions apart in terms of whether it's an interpersonal kind of, my wife told me not to park there and I did it anyway.
Because that's one of his tasks too.
Yeah, and we do have that data as well. So it's something I could, again, go back and look at, but I don't want to say exactly what we found because it's been a while since I looked at that data, but I knew people would be interested in whether or not this was just the sunk cost fallacy, or if it was something a little more broad. So, but yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And our final talk in this session before the discussion session is by George Loewenstein from Carnegie Mellon, who's going to talk to us about wanting and liking for sex by gender and age. A good way to end the afternoon.
Tamar Krishnamurti, who's a graduate student in my department. Okay. So sex is important from a physical, emotional health perspective. Sexual frequency is correlated with longevity, associated with better health. It's the activity that produced the highest happiness among a sample of 1,000 women. Those with no sex partners were very unhappy. And increasing sexual activity is from once a month to once a week is equivalent in terms of happiness of a pay raise of $50,000. So I'm going to talk about the relationship between wanting and liking for sex. From a decision-making perspective, you might think that these are equivalent. That is, that the more you like something, the more you want it. But in fact, there's a lot of research. Kent Baird really opened the door in this research, showing that there's often deviations between wanting and liking. Most of the research on wanting and liking has focused on people wanting something kind of too much, like over-wanting, for example, drugs, and then not actually enjoying the drugs so much. In sex, of course, you have examples of that, but you also have examples of, I would argue, of the opposite, people liking sex. In fact, I'm going to show you some data on that, and not particularly wanting it. So Tamar and I developed, we couldn't find any existing scales to measure wanting and liking for sex, and we developed these scales. I don't have time to show you the details, but here are the scales. They have high reliability. We also wanted to, these scales relate to your wanting and liking of your partner. We only looked at people who are in long-term relationships, in relationships. But we were also interested in general sex drive, so we also developed a scale to measure sex drive. We didn't like any of the scales that we found, so we developed our own. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about research. This is the second phase of, this is the second study we've done. This is with about 2,500 adults. And this was, we deliberately sampled males and females over the lifespan, and we oversampled older males and females because we were interested in that especially. So here, just a few background statistics. I wish I could show you more. This is the frequency of sex by duration of relationship. If they've been together less than a year, about once a week. By the time 6 to 10 weeks, anyway, as you can see, not surprisingly, it drops off dramatically. Who initiates sex? Again, by duration of relationship. This is both initiate it equally. This is the male usually initiates it. And if you, both males and females agree that males tend to initiate sex, but males have a much more extreme perspective. The longer the relationship, the more males think that they initiate, are the ones to initiate sex. But females, the longer the relationship, the same pattern, but it's not as strong. Who controls when they, like, suppose one wants to have sex, the other one doesn't. Who controls whether they do or do not have sex? The best you get is kind of pretty close to both equally. But this is a scale that generally both sides are in great agreement that the female controls when they have sex, and especially the longer they've been together, the more the female is in control of when the couple has sex. Okay, that's kind of background just to give you a taste of the data. Now I want to focus specifically on the wanting and liking. And what we see is first, pretty different patterns of wanting by age. So these are males, their wanting score. You can see that wanting drops as a function of age, but it drops more dramatically for females than for males. The pattern is a bit different for liking. Liking, again, they both drop with age, but here it's much more similar for males and females. So if you compare these two, it seems that the big difference between males and females over the lifespan is on the wanting side, how much they want to have sex, not on how much they actually like sex if they have it. Looking at the same two variables by duration of relationship, these are males, these are females. So wanting, the females are wanting sex their drop-off in wanting is much more dramatic as a function of how long the relationship is than the males. My female friends joke that it's because males are impossible. So, and so of course, if you've been with a male for 10 years, you're going to get sick of him and not want him anymore. But there might be other possible explanations for the, but they start about the same place, but females drop off much faster. Again, the patterns of liking are more similar, although again, for liking too, the women start out higher and end up lower. We looked at the relationship between wanting and liking across people, and we found out what I think is kind of an interesting pattern. Actually, I was showing these data to my undergraduates, and I suddenly, better graph than this one, and I suddenly noticed this pattern, which is it's very, very unusual to want it if you don't like it. But it's very common not to like it. Sorry, not to want it if you do like it. So liking without wanting is common, but wanting without liking is almost non-existent. So what we're really interested in is the relationship between wanting and liking. And so we normalized both variables across the entire sample, and then we look at the difference between them. And what you see is as people get older, the ratio of wanting to liking initially increases. People want it more relative to liking it, but then it drops off for males at around 26 to 35. For females, it just seems to drop off pretty steadily right from the beginning. If you look at duration of relationship, for the men, they seem to want their partners more as a function of how long they've been together, and then it drops off. Kind of similar pattern. We've run regressions to parse the effect of both variables out simultaneously to see what's going on. Duration generally seems to be more important than age, but it's a bit more complicated than that. Okay. Just some other findings. We looked at the relationship between mental health, physical health, subjective happiness, and satisfaction with life as a function of demographics and also sex variables, sexual frequency, and sexual liking. And sexual liking is a very powerful predictor of mental health, subjective happiness, satisfaction with life. Of course, you don't know how the causality goes, but I think these are pretty interesting, super strong effects. Sexual frequency, but not sexual liking, is a predictor of physical health. We are now, if you generally look at there's a very strong relationship between sexual frequency, happiness, and health. Nobody knows why that's happening. So Tamar and I, in another study, were doing the first experimental study to try to understand causality. We're randomly assigning couples to either have their normal level of sex or to double their frequency of sex. We're about 2/3 of the way through the study, and we are, all I can tell you at this point is that our experimental treatment is working. The people who are supposed to have more sex are following instructions. They are approximately doubling their sex. I don't know anything about the dependent measures yet. So, I think generally there seem to be a lot of benefits to sex, but unfortunately, wanting, even though both males and females seem to maintain their liking for sex to a great degree, the wanting seems to drop off pretty seriously. So I think it raises the question of to improve health, to improve quality of life, how is it possible to maintain wanting? We've started looking at that in this data set that I've already been telling you about. So we look at age. This is duration of relationship. What you see that for people, we look at what variables predict what couples are going to maintain their wanting over time. These are couples who don't keep discovering new things about their partner. These are couples who just keep discovering new things about their partner. Their partner is kind of mysterious to them. That seems to be one element of maintaining wanting. Trying new things, something as basic as trying new things sexually. Here's if you don't try new things, here's if you do. That seems to make a difference. This is the very initial stage. It's a huge, very rich data set. But I think it has there's a lot of interesting stuff in it. Okay. Thank you. Time for a question? Okay.
We have time for a couple questions on the top.
I saw that there's a discrepancy over time with men and women in wanting, but the liking was very similar. Do you think that men are, you like sex to the extent that your partner might be liking sex? So do you think that's what's driving it? Is that if the women aren't liking it, then maybe the men are getting, or they're just unsatisfied with how often they're getting it? What do you think is?
Yeah, one of the things we looked at was we asked questions about how excited is your partner by you and how excited are you by your partner. And we found that the patterns were very interesting. Can I reproduce what they were? For women, I can't remember what they are, but I can tell you that it's both wanting and liking, men and women, the relationship between how excited you think your partner is by you and how excited you are by your partner, it makes a very big difference for wanting and for liking and for men and for women. Unfortunately, I don't remember the exact pattern, but I remember it was very interesting. Sorry.
Dave?
Question, have you looked in the NSHOP data for anything related to these kinds of sexual behavior questions? National Social Life Health and Aging Project? It was designed to understand the sexual health of older adults. It has a lot of these kinds of things. Might be of interest.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
I mean, it's there and available. You get your hands on it, so there's a lot there.
You can add your measures. I mean, it's longitudinal.
Okay, yeah.
Although
I think
there's no fMRI, but that's maybe should be.
Yeah, we looked for the similar measures and didn't find them. Yeah, it would be, but we'll definitely take a look at the data set. Yes.
So you started with marriage, distinct things. Have you been thinking about reframing them in terms of those? I wasn't sure where you stood on that, because you sort of distanced it anyway. You said this isn't really addiction, but then it's sort of like addiction. Can you reframe them in those terms, in terms of the different underlying circuits and how that might play out for each?
Well, Berridge has been arguing that the neural circuitry for wanting and liking are overlapping, but to some degree distinct. And so this raises an interesting question. You know, of course, you don't know whether the wanting and liking circuitry for sex is the same as wanting and liking circuitry for other things. But again, there must be an overlap. Yeah, there must be an overlap. I mean, and it would be very interesting to look at the neural correlates of these patterns, because they are very strong patterns.
I should have been more concrete. What I was saying is it would make it very interesting to look at people who were old but were in new couples. Yeah, because that would be the critical question, I would think, to begin to see whether it's age or.
Well, we're doing that with regression. Yes, yeah, we can already and we've been running.
Age or duration?
Duration is more important than age generally, and again there are gender differences in that. But generally, when you put both variables into the regression, the age is less important than duration, which is kind of sad, maybe. Maybe not.
Yeah, I just think it's so interesting, the discrepancy between wanting and liking for women as opposed to for men. So they like it just as much as men do, or maybe almost as much, but when they have it, but they don't want it. And so why is that? I mean, you could think of like an affective forecasting problem there. Or recall biases, and actually made me think of your hot-cold research, that the women are more likely to be in these sort of cold states where it's like they can't remember or imagine that, yes, last time I had sex actually was really great, so you don't want it, whereas the men don't seem to have. Why is that? They don't seem to have. Because they're in hot states.
Well, in a paper I wrote in 1996, which is an academic paper, but I stuck in this bizarre paragraph about sex lives of married couples. And I talked exactly about this phenomenon, that if you've been together with someone for a long time, you might still enjoy sex, but you're no longer aroused. So there's a hot-cold empathy gap. You're in a cold state. It's very difficult to imagine what it would, being in a hot state when you're in a cold state. And so in this paper, I say that the prescription is that you should have sex whether you're in the mood or not, because you'll probably end up enjoying it.
So why don't we bring
Okay,
you back
thank
to
you.
the table with the rest of the panel and open it up for sort of more general discussion. Again, to remind you all of our sort of three themes. We're interested in understanding and discussing how the work that's being done in decision-making and aging and related areas can be applied to advancing our research toward promoting adaptive and healthy aging as the first question. We're interested in the connections which we see, I think, in many of the talks between the three panels we had. So the basic work on social and emotional processes, sort of the more processes related to health and adaptive function over the life course, and work on decision making, how these different domains can talk to one another. And finally, what's the next big question or direction for the research on decision-making and aging to go from your perspectives? Where do you see sort of the low-hanging fruit or the biggest opportunity, or where you can maybe push this theme a bit? And I don't know if any of you are...
Specific question.
Sure, go.
I think we heard a very strong case that decision-making is influenced by age as a sort of a social phenomenon, and we heard a very strong case that decision-making is influenced by age as a set of changes in the brain. And sitting here as an agnostic consumer of this, I would think that one of the places this area is going to go is to start to understand how those two interact and how we begin to parse the variance and understand the processes. Certainly that would have a lot of implications for interventions. So on this kind of, I don't know if it's not too bossy, if it doesn't sound interesting, leave it alone, but I would love to hear you talk a little bit about next steps in beginning to sort of to parse that variance between biology and the experiences, the social experiences that come with living a long life. You already might take it.
Well, I'll try to keep it brief. So doing brain imaging has been interesting for me because it makes me think about time a lot. And before I was interested in emotion, but I didn't think about time as much. And so you have to be very specific about time. And in doing so, made me think more causally, I think. And so we tend to think about emotion as actually driving behavior, driving in a very causal way, memory and things like that. And we may be wrong, but at least it makes testable hypotheses. Like you could say, okay, did the activation occur here? Did they then buy something? Or did they choose to interact with that person? Can you predict one to the other? So I think that's exciting in terms of linking sort of, if you want to call it brain-based or emotion types of brain activation to real choice and social outcomes. But that's just one direction. I'm sure that others would have something to say about the other direction.
And so to make that more concrete, if you had the $10 million stimulus gift,
wow.
What would your first study be?
That's a good question.
Not put you on the spot, but yeah.
I think all of us are interested in linking levels. So to test a causal model across several levels, genetic, brain-based, neuropsychological, psychometric, and also at the social level, to look at various types of risk-taking behavior with incentive-compatible designs. I mean, it sounds like a fishing expedition, but I actually think we have predictions that are temporally specific now. And also look at financial outcomes, because I think those are both empirically tractable, and we are making traction on those, and they matter for people too. So I would look at health outcomes and well-being, but I'd also look at financial outcomes.
Can I ask a potentially related question, which is sort of curious what people's impressions are on how much age-related changes in brain health physiology and strategic differences, maybe depending on sort of your social environment, social interactions, how these two interplay, what's the relative dependence in terms of understanding successful decision-making or successful cognition through age, especially in relation to biomarkers that we talked about earlier this morning, and then things like following a desire for sex, which can imagine being dependent sort of on a combination. And then for fMRI, how do you parse these two apart? So it's kind of a broad question, but it's sort of...
So the two being
brain changes and
well, this is sort of related to interventions too. How much is reversible because it's strategic, depending on the environment, and how much of it's just the fact of getting older, your telomeres or sometimes.
I mean, I think it sort of also becomes puzzling when you look at data like Natalie's, where you've got two groups of older adults who seem relatively intact on many, many measures, and yet you see this difference that's really impacting important areas of decision making, where that integration of emotion and cognition is required. And so the older population, there's a lot of variability, presumably. One might just say, well, something's impaired neurally in the one group, and the other is more like young. So that complicates it, I guess. Part of the issue. But I think, Laura, from your work, the motivations can be manipulated, and so it suggests that there's at least something about what's going on that's not due to changes in the brain.
And the evidence is for that, more than changes in the brain are driving these. I mean, the brain maps behavior, and if we can eliminate the positivity effect behaviorally with a simple instruction, it seems to me that it's hard to make an argument that age-related brain changes led to that behavioral difference. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't brain changes with aging, but for that particular question, I don't understand I can't imagine a case for the brain being the causal factor in that chain of events.
Yeah,
for that kind of...
I mean, you could take something like, the gullibility effect, and you could explain it away in terms of the lack of a somatic marker, but then you could also probably design an intervention to make older people less gullible, like, when the phone rings and someone asks you for your social security number, don't give it, write it on the phone. I mean, that probably will eliminate a lot of that behavior. So my question wasn't which is it, the chicken or the egg, but how do we begin to design research that helps us understand, the relative contributions of these two factors? It is even if it's just a bias that can be overcome, it is something, and how it plays out in people's lives seems to me is something. And I was just wondering where we start on that.
Well, I wrote down as George was talking, because in a way it's that maybe the intervention is to do things, tell people to do things even if they don't want it. If what's changing is that if the intervention is as you said, instruct people to do something even if they don't want it. So if what's changing is desire and what one finds valuable, but the behavior may be valuable even if it's not anticipated in that way, that may be a good instruction. I mean, I think in part it's what Corinna did with her intervention that I showed this morning, where if you just older people over-review positive aspects of choices, but all she had to do was say, be as accurate as you can, which in a sense was saying, do it even if you don't want to, right? That the default was, look at the positive. But that instruction eliminated the effect. So that might be an intervention if one really thinks that the way to improve the functioning of older adults is to get them to do what they don't want to do. So that's
and to get them to do what young adults do.
Right.
Well,
right.
Except a lot of what we're trying to do is to help people do what they want to do,
right,
but never get round to doing, never begin or continue. But I had a very different and maybe totally orthogonal and not very useful question.
Let me just say one thing about this point before we move to that. Is that one other thing.
Didn't sell that very well.
But
she'll pay later. Don't worry.
I'll let you talk.
No.
I just want to say something on this same theme. Is that harking back to what we talked about earlier this morning about the importance of the long life course developmental perspective. The brain changes that you see with aging accrue over a long time, and also many of the changes that you see between groups at aging, such as the size of your hippocampus, may be determined very early in life. So it's not really clear that the people who are doing worse in old age weren't also doing worse on some level or at some brain marker level at a younger age too. And so I think we have to bear that in mind when we're looking at the differences that emerge later in the life course. Richard?
Not totally unrelated. I mean, I'm a little more interested in heterogeneity within populations, translate individual differences, and there is such a thing as experience as opposed to aging, which might be important. And I mean, I've seen lots of fMRIs, yeah, but I missed a big chunk earlier, but nothing on behavior genetics, and that sort of strikes me. I mean, and there is this striking new finding that Steve Sumi presented at the Society for Child Research Development, in which he showed that you can, from leukocytes, you can look at methylation patterns, and that tends to be able to show methylation patterns in some parts of the brain, which I think should perhaps be a game changer, but is...
We actually had a pretty interesting discussion earlier about... I mean, I think it was looking at it, I liked it because it looked at it kind of critically. It's easy to say the next big thing will be the next big thing, but we enjoyed this. We had to talk about biomarkers in general and how useful they are, and also, the genetic variation. And I mean, it was certainly endorsing the utility of both, but it was really trying to look at them critically and say, what can we know and what can't we know. It was an interesting discussion. We haven't had an enormous amount of genetic data presented. We had some, and we had a pretty good discussion.
But might that be another step in the paradigms of this group of collecting DNA and collecting blood serially to be able to get at some of these changes.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment on that topic earlier that I didn't have a chance to, and just the whole idea of probabilistic epigenesis. And, you know, even if you have the genotype, it depends on the environment for the expression. And so that was one of my concerns with getting too heavily invested with genetic markers, is that there's so much input from the environment that will determine whether or not that is even expressed, even if it's, you know, the Gilbert Gottlieb's work showing that, you know, we can breed for generations and still these things won't manifest until there's an environment. I was going to make some other comment on this too and bring it back to this decision-making thing. Now it's blown out of my head.
Natalie?
I have one comment that, and maybe people from NIH could answer. I think why I'm a little afraid to go down the genetic kind of path is that now that we're mapping the genome, it feels like anything I could possibly do is trivial or is a guessing game. So if I were to take a candidate gene approach, it just feels like a shot in the dark, or it'll be perceived as a shot in the dark in the context of mapping the genome. I'm just curious whether
Candidate gene approaches are accepted, and often you'll do a GWAS, find some areas and then do deep mapping in that area. But it's a wild world out there that's changing very rapidly.
Well, you know what I was hoping.
You need to get into that field with some reasonable hypotheses about what systems are likely to be involved. When we originally started looking at genes involved in psychosocial moderation of stress responses, my hypothesis was that the dopamine system would be heavily involved, and we looked at several genes in the dopamine system. And either I was wrong, or we're not looking at it quite the right way. But on the other hand, it turns out that several genes in the serotonin system are involved. We had only hypothesized about the serotonin transporter gene. But what I mean, the larger point is, you look at these systems and you try to make some intelligent assumptions about which systems are likely to be implicated. Dopamine might be more relevant in the decision-making system than it appears to be in psychosocial regulation of stress responses. And then see, if you've got big enough samples and the distribution of the allelic combinations is in your favor, and it's worth a try. I mean, that's the way things are. Many things are moving. I actually wanted to ask Mara a question about your very interesting sex differences. I don't mean to take this completely in a different direction, but I think it's fascinating to find that women's strategies become more conservative under stress and men's more risky. And one can come up with some rather good evolutionary explanations for why that would likely be the case. I was more intrigued by recent findings that have come out of the behavioral finance literature, showing that women seem to be better, when you equate for investment ability and experience, women are actually better at making investments than men are. And I'm guessing from your data that maybe it's primarily stress-related investment decision-making as opposed to investments generally. Because if men are getting more risky under conditions of stress and women less so, women are probably protecting their nest eggs at precisely the time that men are putting it at risk. But it's a hypothesis, but it'd be a fun place to take that stuff.
It'd be very interesting. I mean, the investment context, there are contexts in which you do better if you're more risky, right? Mm-hmm. So like if you're a stock trader, so they've done these studies with testosterone, and testosterone levels correlate with trading ability, and it's all males, right?
There's some problems.
Right, but so there's some context in which you're probably, most people are too conservative, and if the stock market's going up, you're going to be better off if you're a risky trader, and then suddenly it falls, So it is, I think it's going to be very situation dependent which strategies are going to actually end up.
Alex?
I think one of the interesting things would be to look at these decisions under conditions of stress. Brian was talking about the differences he found when he looked at incentive-based versus disincentive-based decision-making. And under stress, we found that this difference between self-reports of positive and negative emotion are less distinct. So they're more inversely related. That is, people are more unitary in their reflections of their feelings. They're either positive or negative, which may actually explain the bias of men leaning toward positivity, protection, and men and women leaning towards negativity, but being more unitary, single lines focused rather than more complex in their decision making regarding how they feel. So I think some way of unifying or looking at emotion underlying some decision making under stress would be a useful endeavor in the future.
Yes.
So linking the stress work with the decision-making work too, I think that a lot of what the stress paradigms that people use are pretty much what's being adapted. I mean, the cold presser task, for example, I guess others could be the Trier. But the outcomes are really different in terms of these two domains that we've talked about today. So the stress work that we talked about this morning is looking at health outcomes. This stress work is looking more at decision makings in daily life, and yet there's a real interface there in terms of health behaviors and the small choices people make on a daily basis that lead to these health outcomes. And I think that's one place where the bridge, I mean, wealth and economic outcomes are very important, but health behaviors and the simple choices we make that accumulate over time are also really key to determining these kinds of outcomes. And I know some of you are working in these domains too, and I wonder if you could speak to sort of new directions or ripe opportunities you see in looking at how this kind of science can impact how we understand how people make small health behavior decisions over time, and especially in aging or with aging relevance. I know, George, you've been doing some behavior economics manipulations. Maybe you could say a few words about what you see as the most promising areas there.
Well, we've been doing a study trying to incentivize old people to do mental exercises on the internet. And we are, the shocking thing, we have a really hard time getting people to do anything generally. I mean, researchers,
so perhaps sex twice more often.
The people in our sample are, we're getting ceiling effects. They are getting on every single day, and we're running out of money, as I told you. Because I've never seen anything like this.
What's the incentive?
What kind of exercises?
Brain exercises. Like they have to play 11 different games, and then they get they're put in pairs, and we are comparing egoistic incentives where they each get paid individually for how many brain exercises they do, cooperative, competitive, all sorts of different incentives. And right now we're in all the incentive conditions, we're getting such high rates, so that we're getting ceiling effects. It's really kind of shocking. But I think in general, it's a lot of the different aging effects that have been discussed, at least in the time that I've been here, have a lot of ramifications for incentive change programs. So like you can use the status quo effect to get people to, if you make the status quo the healthy option, to get people to do healthy things. And a lot of people have been doing that, including us. And if older people are less subject to status quo effects, as your research suggests might be the case, then those types of interventions might not be as effective with older people as with younger. So I think a lot of this research has interesting implications for these types of behavior change programs.
Yeah, actually when I was reading the background papers you included for the talk, I was very excited to see some of the applications of this sunk cost effect and with the exercise. And yeah, I thought your point you made in one of the papers, or one of your co-authors made, I'm not sure, about how to structure the environment so that the healthy choice is the default, was a great suggestion. And I couldn't help but think of it when I walked into the Marriott and they had all those snacks out there with, where you just touch it and you're going to have to pay for it. I mean, it's just the opposite of structuring the environment to promote an unhealthy choice. It's very interesting.
There is one concern I'd like to ask about the incentives. So
a laboratory experiment, there's always the external validation, whether the incentives are provided in the lab bear any resemblance to the incentives in the real world. So you run it with much higher incentives, a little bit, and hope to get different results, or say similar results. So we just found kind of worrisome among younger subjects in one experiment, raising the stakes tenfold, they do better. They give more attention to it. And older subjects actually have the opposite. So they give it more attention but do worse. The only concept, and I was really interested in the stress issues, is that the higher stakes induce a greater level of stress, perhaps that interrupts performance. But that, I think, might be also a little bit of a fearsome thing, that then in changing the incentives for older subjects might actually cause some negative repercussions if those become stressors. So I'm just kind of curious. I have never run, this is my first time running experiments in older subjects, if there's any other, I guess, thoughts or input on the size of stakes for older population.
One of the criticisms that often comes is actually in the other direction, suggesting that, you know, well, the reason that 1095 for the film doesn't matter anything to the older adults is because they're not young, they're not saving money, they've kind of established. I mean, this kind of goes against that, and I think, you know, some of the work that Brian has done suggests that you can get people very engaged in tasks for very small stakes, you know, and there's emotion rating data to suggest that that's actually the case. But this is an interesting sort of counterpoint to that, and I don't really know that anyone's looked at.
It'd be neat to know what they're feeling.
What's that?
Well, it'd be neat to know what they're feeling, like if they're taking risks, if they're more fearful than, for instance, or younger
Right, so
subjects.
that's basically the issue. As I said, you know, we had no survey work to go with these observations, so I think.
And the task was something, it was to take risk or not?
It was a risky task, yes. But it's an objective risky task, meaning in the sense that there is objectively better or worse decisions.
And the older adults took less risk than they were under, had higher incentives.
So again, it's kind of, I don't want to monopolize this and take over. It's not an issue of taking on more or less risk, it's taking the right risk or the wrong risk. So one risk is better than the other. And they made higher rates of errors under higher stakes than under low stakes. So the validation went the wrong way in some sense.
I think that really underlines the importance, all the discussion so far, the importance of understanding the causal mechanisms if we want to make practical improvements in people's lives. You know, what is the effect of the incentive? Is the effect of incentive to motivate? Well, it sure looks on the surface like it's to motivate, but maybe it's to produce anxiety. Is it really a status quo effect, or is it some other effect? Does it have to do with some fundamentally different causal mechanism? And you know, we in our rush to be relevant, which is a good thing, it's good to be relevant. I just think this really underlines the paradox of this. The paradox is we have to think more about causal mechanism, more about underlying process, and what are we really measuring, and what are we really manipulating, than if we're not relevant.
So I want to take the prerogative of an organizer to make the last comment and then release you for a break, and we'll come back and sum up in a minute. Just to highlight the fact that, as probably many of you know, the NIH is engaged in an NIH-wide effort to advance the science on behavior change, to be more focused on sort of mechanistic aspects from the basic science that can inform the ways that we design and conduct interventions to improve people's lives on all of the domains we've been talking about today, including small decisions, large-scale decisions, health behaviors, and so forth. Looking at it from a life course perspective with insights from the impact of socioeconomic position on how people are able to engage in behavior change. So one of the goals of all of this is to really bring the basic science in fields like psychology, affective, social and cognitive neuroscience, neuroeconomics, and behavior economics, and all of the areas that all of you are engaged in, to the table with the people who are doing the intervention work, because so much of that has been dispersed out in disease-focused silos, not really focusing on the basic core phenomena such as self-regulation or executive function or incentive-based reward processing that might be driving what people do. And so I hope that you will all pay attention to what happens at NIH, as we hope there will be some initiatives coming out of the efforts that we're really putting in right now to develop this dialogue across the disciplines and hopefully bring the psychologists and behavior economists to the table there to be big players in that.
So So we're not going to do much more work. So I think the first thing we wanted to say is thank you for coming.
Yes.
Wow.
And thank you to Bob's team here at Berkeley for putting on a great show.
Liz and Elizabeth and who else is in the room? That's about it.
Yeah, and to my colleague Rosie Sood at NIA, who and we don't need to thank each other. Thanks, Bob.
This was a ton of fun for us. We had a lot of fun putting it together. And I was talking to someone at the break, and I was reminding me, she was marveling at all the people who are. She was what? No, that's I do that. So she was marveling at all the people who were here, who she had, all the famous people, and it reminded me of the famous picture in Harlem one afternoon of all the jazz musicians. So we should have a picture like that on the front steps. But we don't have time. So the one thing we would like to ask, I have one little piece of housekeeping for speakers. Turns out there are 2 consent forms in here. If you didn't fill them both out, please do. And then the one other thing that we wanted to just get a little feedback from you on is, last year we did a kind of a didactic meeting at APS where we sort of said, what would you need to know how to do if you wanted to take your basic science and apply it to the study of aging? And so we had questions on, we had discussions of sampling and having older people in laboratory experiments and trying to demystify, lower that sort of apparent bar to get into this area of work. And then the goal this time, this will be interesting, because I'll tell you what our goal was, and you can tell us if we came anywhere close, was to sort of take a snapshot of what was really going on in the labs of the major players in these 3 areas of science. And, and to talk about it with other people who are in this area and walk away with just a sense of what was cooking in the various, this is a bad metaphor, in the various stoves and ovens around the world of aging research. Horrible, right? So now the next thing is, well, we may do something, or someone may do something next year. Don't give us that for surprise look. It's very easy to do.
You used the word singular. You're singular. We want to see something that goes on for 3 or 5 years.
Oh, so that look of horror was actually that we underestimated it.
Yes.
Yeah, so the question was, well, the question was, what next? What would be a good thing that would be useful for you, for the field, for people who are thinking about working in this area, for people who are thinking of getting out of this area, for, I mean, what would you like to see next? I mean, what would be a good APS NIA joint venture for the next few years? Any thoughts?
Yeah.
I should stop talking and get the,
So I'm a newcomer to aging research, so I have a lot of thoughts about how to jump the hurdles and get into this. And I've been sitting here looking at this picture of the early IPARians. For those of you who don't know, IPSR used to be Institute for Personality Assessment and Research, before it was Institute for Personality and Social Research, and I'm pretty sure Erik Erikson is in that picture. And so, the bumper stickers, what would Jesus say? I'm thinking, what would Erik Erikson say about the field? And as a newcomer to the area, I see all these comparisons between old and young. But what about life stage? And is there an interest in starting to look at specific kinds of aging processes that might be, akin to different life goals? And or is that old news and it was tried and didn't work? But as someone entering into aging research, I'm very interested in
which populations, and whether it's time to do finer gradations rather than just older, younger. And could we draw on some, not necessarily Erickson, but on some other work about the challenges unique to different life stages within older populations?
Thanks, Jen.
To
Very
channel
helpful.
Freda a little bit from her presentation at APS last year, the standard initial study people do is the old-young comparison in many of these to establish effects. But the interest really is, at least from our perspective, is in the life course and moving things back to look at processes as they may emerge over different life stages. Now, chronological life stages, but as you're suggesting, sort of goal-relevant life stages may also be decoupled from chronological age. So certainly there's a strong interest in that, and I think more people are moving to that in the aging, psychology and aging field. And we didn't really get a full taste of that, but I don't know if Laura or Freda want to add to that at all.
Well, there's a lot of research that takes that perspective. What you've seen a lot of here is what I was saying in the last APS too, is establishing a phenomenon where you want to take an extreme age group's design. But I was trained as a developmental psychologist, and so was Laura, et cetera. So, I mean, I have data from adolescence all the way through older adulthood in a lot of the studies that I do. And there's a lot of researchers that do have that. You just happen to get a sampling of extreme age group designs. But that's not necessarily the norm. I mean, in the aging field, there's a lot of people that are much more developmentally oriented and then more experimental gerontology oriented too. So you, yeah.
But let's remember what the task is. I mean, this would be an interesting idea for a focus for another meeting.
Yes.
But you had mentioned something on behavioral genetics.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the full study of the life course, there's evolution, revolution, and, doesn't have to revolve around generativity and integrity, etc. But and integrative. But I think that's right for a renaissance in terms of pulling together multiple longitudinal studies, some of which start prenatally. There's a wonderful one in this that started out in Berkeley, the Berkeley Open Growth Study that's got 75, 80 years of data. But I think there are new methodologies and technologies, one of which is genetics, but the other is getting together with economists who have different ways of analyzing data that I think is going to change the whole field. I think the new methodologies is right for that. So I'd like to see something on that coming up.
The classic stage models of aging, though, really didn't hold up to empirical test, a la Erickson and some of the others. And what Bob will know better about Valiance, from the grant study, do you see evidence for stages?
No. I mean, George likes to see some evidence, but in fact, the empirical data doesn't show that. It shows quite a bit of individual variability. For example, what kind of life stage are you in if you have small children and you're 62? How do you think about your future? And we have many men who decided to have second and a couple even third families. And that's where
it changes you. Yeah. And that was, I heard Erickson give a talk when he was in his 90s, and he was saying, well, it's true that maybe the stages, he said, I really still like this theory, but maybe the stages don't always go in the same order. And maybe sometimes you can have generativity first, and you can, I'm just sort of listening going, basically, he didn't have a stage model by the time he was done talking.
Now, Susan, you had a comment.
I was just going to reinforce the idea of looking at different life stages, because if any of the phenomena that people are interested in co-vary with status, social status, younger people are not high status and old people are not high status. So in fact, you may be shooting yourself in the foot if you compare younger people and older people, because the high status people are people in the prime of their lives.
It's hard to get high status people into the lab.
Exactly right. You think older people are difficult.
Except the Loewenstein study.
just another idea. I mean, one of the things that was so nice about today was this juxtaposition of people doing things really differently and have different tools and different frameworks. And so it's great to come up with a whole other set of topics, but the other strategy is to figure out some way to have a meeting that actually takes this or some variation of this group and put them together in a way that actually builds research. Take some of these ideas and some of these connections and make them happen. It starts to happen at a meeting like this, but then what do you do next, right? I mean, somebody will email someone, but there are all kinds of mechanisms for getting people to talk to, small groups, and you come up with it. I just think there could be another level with this group that might be really productive.
So one thing that might contribute to that would be there were a few places in the literature today where there was a conflict or a potential conflict between findings. One set of studies found this kind of effect, one set of studies found this kind of effect. Clearly there's some sort of moderator, what is it? And that, you could sort of piece it together from different talks, but it wasn't explicit. So something that focused on that kind of contrast and then tried to come up with some resolution for those conflicts would be really interesting.
So as I mentioned, what Richard mentioned actually at the beginning of the day, that there are a number of RFAs that we're promoting and a number of recommendations from our review of our division that we are actively trying to work on. And one was this idea of sort of these different kinds of training opportunities or the building of networks. So we have an initiative that's been approved by our council to develop networks for interactions among researchers. We can, to some extent, ourselves support meetings out of our operating budget, but we can also work with you to support activities that you apply for grants to do. So we have meeting grants, we will have some network opportunities coming out, and I think the sort of the best result of a workshop. I think one reason why this one worked out very well was working together, Bob and I, from the outside and the inside of NIA, instead of, single-handedly us deciding who to bring to the table. There was much more dialogue around that. And we'd like to see people who are interested in pushing these kinds of dialogues forward come to us with ideas for formats, for seminars, summer institutes, and we'll talk about how we can try to work together to make those things happen. And for something that's going to be sustained over several years, that's really kind of essential for us to have that input from your side.
Part of the problem is a structural one, that in psychology we don't, for whatever reason, historically, we don't have the equivalent of the demography and economic centers that we have, where there are a network of 13 of them, and with a coordinating center, and one RAND always does their summer institute, mini med school, to which you should look on the web and perhaps send students to. And we lack that infrastructure, so I think we've got to make it up some other way so that there's some degree of continuity, but also self-direction. And there, I think, stages like generativity and despair and
I just don't go in that order.
As a parent.
Motivational theory of grant writing.
But motivation is the other thing I was going to say. I didn't hear, I missed bits, and maybe lots was said that I didn't hear, but again, something on choices people make, motivation, whether they decide to accumulate people or money or power or what. It'll be nice to get something like that going. The other thing is you don't have many other disciplines here, and I think at some point it would be useful to get together with surrounding disciplines, but you can do both. There could be one meeting that tends to be broader, one that is narrow and more concentrated. I wish there was a way that we could easily fund a group to go to the Stanford Center for what used to be the advanced study. Maybe it still is.
Yeah, it is.
I don't know. There have been some changes but something like that I looked for, but we didn't quite have the right mechanism. The other thing that I think would help that could take the place of centers, but again, this discipline hasn't gravitated to that a lot, would be something we call program projects, which are, I mean, NIA has by far the largest prevalence of program projects of any of the 28 other institutes and centers, but they have at least 3 R01-like projects with a number of cores, and there could be a core that's designed to bring people together in this way, so that it's institutionalized. And then I think people should be thinking really that the large-scale $10 million projects, I mean, those, you should be thinking about those, because if they're good, they tend to happen.
Yeah, the other thing because it came up a bit, and we talked about it a lot at our meeting in London last year, this interface between the laboratory work and the survey work. And there are a lot of ways that interface can happen. And people don't always know about the resources, the data resources. I was, as I mentioned, delighted that Dave Sabara, when he found out about the N-shaped study, went in and took his research questions to that publicly available data and was able to relate that to some of the stuff that he's doing in the lab. So that's one way of going in. But there are other ways too. So I know, the health and retirement study looks at all kinds of economic outcomes and has biomarkers and rich psychosocial data that has been added in recent waves. There are foreign studies like the German socioeconomic panel study that has a whole sort of testing module for putting in experimental modules, and they're open to all different kinds of experimental paradigms in terms of economic outcomes and so forth, that before they put it into their big study, that gives psychologists opportunities to go in and in larger scale kinds of populations begin to look at some of these effects that you're seeing. And I think we can support work from you going to those foreign studies or other studies to take a look at these kinds of things.
Is there a mechanism for that?
You would use a regular grant mechanism. I mean, for secondary analysis, we do have a special R03 for that, but you can do this just through a regular.
So I've been on study sections where this has come up, and I think it's a great idea. And what happens, the trickle down of this, is the actual study section members say, why doesn't the person just do this? Instead of like, why are we funding this? Why doesn't the person just go and do this on their spare time? You can just sort of find the time to do it. And so I think the message does need to get out that this is a legitimate way to approach a grant and a legitimate means of person time.
I mean, I think that one of the issues there is that for psychologists typically don't do this kind of work, and they're not familiar with getting into the data set time and understanding the models that need to be developed for working with these data. And so the more people like yourself and others who are doing this, that are on the study sections and can educate people, I mean, I've seen this too, that will help, but it's a disciplinary barrier, I think. You don't see that in the population science.
In population sciences, it's absolutely accepted, and so we've got to find a way to change the culture of reviewers. And that's something that is difficult for us because it's influencing the jury, but that's what we want to do. And I don't know, perhaps we should be writing editorials in journals that reviewers might read. Let me add something else. I think you also need to be a little more worried and concerned about your trade and export of your findings. I disappeared this morning to go to a meeting on behavioral economics in Barrow Hall, where they're also talking psychology, but a different type of psychology. But boy, they should have heard something about sunk costs and very, very relevant. So that's not. There's some barriers there that still need breaking down, and maybe we've got a lot of failed marriages to our credit, but maybe something.
A few successes, I think. Could the economists in the room please raise their hand? So they're working. They came to the psychology meeting.
And our RFAs some of them will require mixed marriages.
Yeah. Incentivize that.
But
Those are things that I think government can really, you can provide incentives for that,
Yes.
for people
Yes.
cross disciplines, and you
Yes.
know, a grant has to have one of this and one
I
of
mean,
that, and
yeah,
that will facilitate those.
there are a lot of same discipline marriages, but
Well, I hope that to some extent we made a little headway on bridging some of
But-
our silos in psychology with these discussions.
we'd also like to know, you know, what we should be thinking about pushing and developing as the next initiative, and that sometimes comes from us, but usually it comes from us listening to people and hearing a good idea.
Laura, you had a...
Oh, well, I was just slightly more cynical person. I was going to come back to the issue of the reviewer panel. So, you know, I think one of the challenges when you put in interdisciplinary proposals,
Yes.
and you do have people from very different disciplines, and you only have X number of pages to write the grant, is that
Yeah.
inevitably the reviewers don't think you've spent enough time on the piece that's there. So I think this is, you know, there's always a call for interdisciplinary work, but, you know, I live in a really interdisciplinary setting, and we frequently have the experience where people are like, well, you didn't spend enough time on this one.
Let me address that, and it's going to get worse because the number of pages that an R01 is going to drop to 12, which, and the worst thing to happen is to have a group of specialists on the review panel who will kill the thing in terms of their special expertise, and not to have anybody on the panel who's actually done interdisciplinary research. So that we did have a roadmap, an NIH roadmap activity on interdisciplinary research, and it's fared okay. I think there are a couple of ways around that. One is RFAs, but we can only do a very few RFAs, and we've got to fight for them. The other is our program projects, which don't get reviewed as quite as well as we wanted. We like, as they used to be, where you'd have reviewers would come in for 2 days, and there'd be a on-site review, and you'd be able to question the people from that. But so it's now done over the phone, but they try to do that. But we tend to be able to suggest reviewers. We don't make decisions, and you tend to get a better, a more apt group, relevant group of reviewers. So think program project.
All right, I think we have to let the CAB people go.
Okay.
So I think, I also don't want to just kind of devolve into a discussion about review.
No.
If you have any other ideas for future conferences, then you can get a chance to share them. Please let us know. And thank you all.
Thank you.